There are 22 days till Christmas. 528 hours. If you want to figure it out, I use the calculator. 31,680 minutes. How long is a minute? Ready? Get set. Go. Why does sitting in silence for 1 minute seem so long compared to, say, 1 minute during a great action movie? Why does a 60-second traffic light, a red light specifically, feel agonizingly slow, while 60 seconds with a grandchild is exceedingly brief? Why is 22 days until Christmas not enough time to make all of our holiday preparations, seemingly? But for a child, you say 22 days till Christmas, like, oh, that's eons. Time is fleeting. Time is precious. Sometimes time flies, and sometimes time stands still. All of this to say that timing is important. When things happen and how they happen, timing is important. I knew Joyce Harmon my freshman year in college, but it was at the organizational fair at the start of sophomore year when I saw her in her blue touring car blazer, which nicely set off her long red hair, which is much redder than it is now. And when that happened at that fair, I was smitten and decided to ask Joyce Harmon out. That was sophomore year, and I asked Joyce on a date, but evidently my timing was off, for she declined. So I asked her out again, senior year. Timing is important. And senior year, she said yes. The short story, the way I usually tell that is, I asked Joyce out sophomore year, and she said yes, senior year. Either way, we both have agreed that if we had started dating sophomore year, the relationship probably wouldn't have made it till senior year for a variety of reasons. We each have our own version of that, why that would be. Timing is important. The summer after our senior year and graduation, I held a picnic at my home with some college friends. Joyce was among them because we were still dating then, because we had started dating senior year. And it was that summer, it was late that night after the picnic, after the friends had left, that Joyce and I were alone, and I found myself asking her to marry me. I say I found myself because this was unplanned. The words just came out of my shy self, and when what I can only say was a divinely inspired moment. And the timing was right because she said yes. Okay, it took a couple of minutes, but she did say yes. Timing is important. Now, it could be that just given that she had traveled across Pennsylvania the day before, coupled with the all-day picnic, that she was just really tired at the end of the day and her defenses were done, and I said, will you marry me? And it's like, yeah, I guess. But I like to think of it as God's timing that made all the difference. It was God's timing. God has good timing. In Galatians 4:4, it says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son. God dispatched his son Jesus to earth at just the right time. And historians and scholars tell us why it was the right time. It was the right time politically because the Roman Empire was at its height. While it certainly had its flaws, Rome gave a large part of the world good roads and what some would say at least was a fair system of government. It was the Roman peace, the Pax Romana. And for the first time in history, people could travel with ease and making it possible for news to spread rapidly throughout the land. And this meant a few years later when the early Christians needed to take the message of Jesus to the far reaches of the world, of the empire, I should say, then it would be easier then than it had been at any time in history. It was also a good time and the right time culturally because the Greek language and culture brought an element of cohesion to society. More people were being educated and were able to read, and there was this language, Greek, Koine Greek, a common language, and the New Testament was eventually written in Koine Greek, a language the majority of people would understand. Again, it made it more likely for the message of Jesus to take hold. It was the right time. And some argue that it was the right time spiritually because the average citizens of Rome were getting tired of the same old religion. The mythological gods of Greece and Romans weren't cutting it anymore, had lost their grip on the folks, and even the Jews, some believe, were hungry for something more. One person argues it was time when many people longed for a relationship with God. It was authentic and about more than just keeping the rules. Don't know whether you can prove that, but it seems possible. In a very new book, I have not read the book, just an excerpts of it. It talks about the era between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I really don't know much about that. I was reading the article with some interest because Philip Jenkins argues that the key changes in that what he calls this crucible era had a dramatic impact on Judaism and Christianity. And he outlines the sweeping transformation of religious thought at that point. New ideas were being interjected. He talks about the time when Jews grappled with the overwhelming forces of Hellenization, the Greek influence, and globalization. He says Judaism produced new religious ideas that responded to a changing world. He says the revolutionary politics of that era created an apocalyptic worldview where earthly struggles reveal cosmic significance, a universe dominated by angels and demons. And by the fall of the temple in 70 AD, concepts that might once have seemed bizarre became normalized and thus passed on to Christianity. It was a different time, an open time. It seems it was the right time. It was not too soon. It was not too late. When the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son. It was the end of an age. It was the beginning of a new day, a new age, the day of salvation. So God's rescue mission had begun in earnest. The Lord was coming. He was coming to redeem, to deliver humanity from slavery to sin and death, to adopt us as his beloved children. And God seemingly chose the best time for this to happen. His timing was just right. It was time. But that's easy for me to say. I'm not sure the prophets would have agreed. I mean, they had been announcing the coming Messiah for generations, and people had passed on that message. Maybe they would have been more apt to say, hey, it's about time. It's about time. Where have you been? And what about those who had lived under the oppressive legalism, keeping the law of God down to the tiniest detail so as to please God? They were slaves to the law. Would they agree with the timeliness of God's new way? Or would they have said, hey, God, you're late. Where have you been? My time has passed. What about them? What about their ancestors? And maybe you know that feeling. Wanting God to intervene, to heal your friend's cancer, or to rescue you from an addiction, or to save a marriage, or whatever it is, and nothing happens until it's too late. And you think, wow, where's God's timing now? It's too late. I think we need to be careful with the notion of God's timing lest we lose faith or we misconstrue God. A pastor said to his congregation, God not only came at just the right time, God continues to come to us at just the right time. Just when we need him most, he is there. When do you need a miracle? When you have no more options and no more resources, you are in a position to receive a miracle from God. And I like that, and I want to believe that, but the problem is what happens when we don't get our miracle in the time that we think we need that miracle, and do we stop believing? Have we created a scenario in which it's either or? Part of the problem comes when we seek to determine what that miracle should look like. That we want to define the miracle. The early Christians, they had hoped for deliverance from Rome. Instead, their Messiah rescued them from sin and death, but not Rome. They had hoped for a Messiah to restore the promised land, but they ended up being scattered around the region, and Jerusalem and its temple had been leveled, eventually were leveled to the ground. That's not what they had expected. You see, we too often, I think, connect God's timing with our agenda and our desires, and when it doesn't happen, it's like, hey, God, you're late. It's too late. So we need to be careful. Sometimes things happen according to God's timing, we think, because they're good. Something good happens, something a little unordinary, and we say, boy, God's timing is perfect. But what if somebody next to you had wanted the same thing and wanted it to happen in a certain time and it doesn't happen? Do they say, well, where's God now? You see, it sets up this dichotomy that I think we have to be careful about, because one person's blessing can be another person's curse. Good timing for one may not happen for the other. Advent builds our anticipation of God's help and rescue. And we need to remember that's the umbrella here, is that at the right time, God sent his Son. And we prepare for that, and we build that sense of anticipation in this Advent season with a word that we really don't like to hear. Wait. Wait. If you tell a child to wait, it's like that's the last thing they want to hear. But the secret is that we adults don't like it any more than the children. We have to wait. Be patient. Wait for what God might do in good time. I think that's the language we need here. Wait for what God might do in God's good time. May or may not be what we want. God will come at the right time and provide what we need when we need it. We may think what we need is healing, but what God may want to give us is courage. We may want some extra money, and God might say, well, I want you to learn a more simple lifestyle to live on the money you got. Or we may desire a quick fix to a problem, and God invites us to persevere in the midst of the problem, recognizing and calling upon his presence to help you. And God's timing may be quite different than ours. We work now in seconds, milliseconds. God's plan evolved over great eons of time. How long had they waited for the Messiah to come? And we continue to wait for Christ to come again. We need to get in tune with God's timing. God had been preparing Israel for the coming Messiah, and they were to wait. But we need to understand this word waiting. Waiting is not to be passive. We tend to think of waiting as waiting in line, where you can do nothing else but stand there or grumble while you stand there. That's not waiting. Waiting is meant to be active. Someone has said that spiritual transformation doesn't take place when we get what we want. Spiritual transformation takes place while we're waiting. It is forged in us while we're waiting and hoping and trusting, even though we have yet to receive what we long for. Spiritual transformations happens in the waiting room, he said. Spiritual transformations happen in the waiting room, in the waiting time. There is meant to be transformation. Advent is a transformative time. As we wait, it is to transform us. Waiting helps us to learn the vital lesson that just because God seems to delay or God has a different agenda, it doesn't mean that our desires are being denied. It doesn't mean that God isn't going to work in our lives. It's God's timing. When we continue to hope patiently and place our trust in God and God's timing, not ours, we begin to get a different perspective, often a bigger perspective than our little lives, a longer-term perspective than our brief time. And we want it to be God's perspective, to be patient, to wait for what God might do in good time. In a devotional, The Daily Bread, it said, God's timing is rarely our own, but it is always worth waiting for. That's a good word for Advent. God's timing is rarely our own, but it is always worth waiting for. In the fullness of time, God sent his Son. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.